All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for the opportunity to join you this evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. I am going to just overview regenerative agriculture somewhat writ large and then discuss how it affects the community work that we do. I'm visiting you all today from North Central California. I live near the Point Reyes National Seashore, north of San Francisco, on the Pacific Ocean. And we work in 51 counties in California. And we work with this community of producers and growers, small manufacturers, artisans, designers, and brands who have their corporate headquarters in our region as well. And our auspice is the concept that we all live in a food shed, we all live in a watershed, we all live in a fiber shed, and many other sheds, in fact. The concept of shed thinking is something that is endemic to all of our ancestors and to many of our communities that still live in the geographic context of thinking about geography and topography and soil and precipitation as defining of where your water comes from, where your food comes from. And especially living in the United States, the daughter of European immigrants, and living in a land that's been colonized, I think it's of great import to be able to recognize how to live in a strategic geography without needing to draw from resources from other landscapes. And so Fibershed really is kind of an amelioration or a medicinal balm to repair and restore and unpack our thinking as those of us who've been part of nation states that have colonized and have done so to extract resources from other places. So how do we repair? And part of that is just fully owning and taking responsibility for what we can create within a region or a landscape. And all of this work is done within the lens of the carbon cycle. So this is a cycle we have been harmonizing with or not. The repercussions of having the concentration of CO2e in the atmosphere that we currently have is a repercussion or a consequence of not harmonizing with this cycle. There are 5 pools of carbon on the planet, the oceans being the largest, the soils being the second largest, the biosphere, atmosphere, and lithosphere being 3 other carbon pools that also contain carbon, but are cycling it differently. The lithosphere is where fossil carbon derives from, where most of the textile industry is currently deriving its material resources from. The atmosphere absorbs the heat that is emitted through the extraction and refinement of fossil carbon. So the concept to harmonize with the carbon cycle is to work within the biosphere and to help carbon cycle in ways that can A, reduce the legacy load of carbon that we've put into the atmosphere, B, return lost carbon stocks that have been emitted into the atmosphere through tillage, overgrazing. Agriculture itself has had its own significant contribution to atmospheric carbon concentrations. Ice core samples going back to the mid-1700s show the soil carbon emission concentrations rising into the atmosphere at the time of the Mohlberg plow being used more ubiquitously in ag lands across the world, starting in Europe. So plowing has always been a way in which we oxidize CO2e out of the atmosphere. So this concept here is, let's be conscious of this cycle. Carbon isn't going anywhere. It's not actually a pollutant. It's just functionally in the wrong place. So to call it a pollutant is kind of it's an unfortunate way because to relate to it, because it's actually a feedstock for microorganisms, and we actually need it in the soil. So a lot of the climatologists that I work with have acknowledged this. Starting in 2013, James Hansen, who's one of my climate heroes who worked for NASA, got in front of Congress and the United States and just said, you're going to need two very concrete strategies to create a stabilized climate and to return to Holocene level temperatures. Holocene level temperatures are the temperatures in which agriculture and humanity evolved out of. It's the temperature modulation that allowed us to produce grain, to work with domestic animals, to domesticate animals out of these interglacial periods where the earth freezes. We've had this incredible fruiting of human culture, civilization. James Hansen says, if you want to retain those temperatures that allow you to thrive on this particular planet and this part of the solar system and this part of the universe, you have two strategies in which you need to articulate and implement at a very quick pace. And one is, of course, smokestacks and tailpipes. We need to create net neutrality there, or carbon neutrality. We can't keep emitting and burning lithosphere-based carbon. And we simultaneously have to take the legacy load out of the atmosphere through improved agricultural, forestry, reforestation, and other land repair systems. The other scientist that I'm a big fan of is Dr. Ritam Lal, and his math is, Nobel Prize winning. So he is someone who has looked at the analysis of the last remaining agricultural landscapes that are not paved over or developed. If we were to take those anthropogenically managed systems and we were to enhance photosynthetic carbon capture, cover crops, reforestation, wetland restoration, reducing tillage, eliminating tillage, adaptive managed grazing. If these practices were implemented on the remaining ag lands and we were to draw down a conservative amount of carbon, additional carbon into those systems, we could draw down 2.45 petagrams of carbon. A petagram is 1 billion tons. So if we did that work by 2100, this would mean that the soils and the vegetation combined could remove 333 billion tons of carbon. And this equates to removing 157 parts per million. So when you think about really surgically approaching your understanding of climate, I think everyone should be looking at ppm, parts per million. How much is in the atmosphere? How much heat trapping gas is there? And how is it moving? Is it moving down? Are we reducing that ppm, or are we increasing it? That's really your temperature gauge for survival. So if you can remove 157 ppm, we actually get to pre-industrial revolution levels, which are Holocene level temperatures, which would bring us to 263 parts per million, which is safe and stable. So this is hopeful, but it also means activation, implementation, and the fashion industry, of course, and the food systems and the natural medicine systems and fuel systems, they all have to come along for the ride to make this real. So the way that we've been thinking about carbon and cycling is through this concept of soil to soil, the idea that we regenerate the landscapes from which fiber comes. We regionalize the production. We bring the carbon footprint down in the way we transport items, the way we work together, the way we collaborate. In many ways, we look back to move forward. And so this idea that carbon, your clothes are carbon, they are actually physically atmospheric carbon. Cotton is atmospheric carbon transformed into biosphere-based carbon. Wool is atmospheric carbon transformed into a protein. All these forms of carbon that you're wearing, whether it's lithosphere-based or biosphere-based, are you wearing ancient carbon? Are you wearing fresh carbon? Ideally, you're wearing fresh carbon and you can recycle that back to become part of the soil again. The soil needs that carbon. It needs it. It's a feedstock for microbes and fungal networks. Without it, the soil is inert. Without it, the soil dies. Clothing needs to return to the place from which it came. That's circular economics, in my opinion. So then here we are just at the landscape level, not the conceptual level, not the scientific theory level. And this is the Holzman Ranch. Hannah is working. She's been on this ranch with her family since the mid 1800s, which for California, it's a long time. It's during the settler period. And there are women ranchers in our community who do an incredible job of stewarding landscapes, even within the context of colonialism and stolen land. There are people who on the land today are nurturing and caring for it, and caring for animals and grasslands and conifer forests in ways that are remarkable. And they are people who we collaborate with to understand what we can do to produce regional clothing, particularly with wool, because California is the largest wool producer in the United States. We have a very heterogeneous wool supply. We have a lot of primitive breeds, and it's not like a ubiquitous merino like you might see out of Australia or perhaps New Zealand. The cotton supply in California, we grow the world's largest supply of extra or ELS cotton. So one of the things we've been doing is bringing some of the brands who have corporate headquarters in this region into the San Joaquin Valley. The San Joaquin Valley of California produces 80% of the world's almonds. It exports $50 billion a year worth of agricultural product. It's a very industrial, it's production agriculture. So we've been asking ourselves, this is in our Fibershed, how can we start to bring repair and soil repair and some of this thinking into these production ag systems? Because this is our backyard. This is the reality of where we live. How do we engage with this system? How do we localize production in these systems that are very export focused? So one of the ways we've been doing that is working in landscapes, both in the field itself where the cotton and the wool is produced, but also in the periphery, and looking at beaver analogs, because we're getting less snow. So how do we slow spread and sink water the way beavers would? That's the top left. We're restoring native habitat along creeks. We're putting in redwood tree windbreaks. We're making large compost piles. We're putting in pollinator shelter belts. We're reducing tillage and negating tillage. And those landscapes that this work was going on are showcased here. This is where the products are starting to come from those landscapes, and there's designers who are collaborating at this level at multiple scales of production. So here's our first community supported cloth project that we did in 2000, excuse me, in 2017, 18. We had a fashion show in 2019. The whole ability for us to wash this wool and get it into a fine gauge yarn and be able to weave it locally, we had to wash it on the backs of an order that the North Face put in for our wool. So we were able to get 102 home sewers and artists access to our wool in the form of a cloth that was actually, in most cases, other than the washing and the carding, it was all locally manufactured, but we don't have the washing facilities regionally, and we don't have some of the fine gauge spinning. So the mill minimums at those facilities were quite high. And so teaming up with a large brand to make those mill minimums actually released the textile. We peeled off some of this textile and we got it out to the community. So we've seen that collaborations with small and large brands be very effective in making sure material resources actually do end up in the community. And some of the practices when the cloth is sold or when the wool or the cotton is sold, there's price premiums paid because we're taking people out of the global commodity market and we're building direct markets. As the direct markets are established, we build out funding. We have a carbon farm fund, and we fund these kinds of practices. And these have been known since the Dust Bowl in the United States to be practices that build soil. We've known this for, again, decades, and we've been measuring the impact of these practices on carbon, water infiltration, microbial biomass. We've been understanding the effect of these practices across our soils in the US. And so we can make impact statements about implementing them. What does it mean for climate? What does it mean for water? And so this is the slide that just shows, the cycle that we're invested in is to be able to, again, tether economics to carbon, but not in this concept that we've seen where it's like, oh, let's offset our carbon by putting money into a mangrove project. I mean, those are all good projects. However, we ultimately, to solve the climate situation, we need to be, every piece of clothing and food needs to embed all the costs of production, the healthcare costs of the farm workers, the nitrate emissions that go into the water, the carbon emissions that we need to internalize costs. And once we do that, the kinds of agriculture we want to see, regenerative, organic, textile brands are constantly coming to me and have this very beautiful idea of what they want to see. And then there's this delta between what they want to see and what they want to pay. And that delta has to shrink. So the kinds of funds, though, that we have been putting into the landscape, this is from 2019 to 21. These are the kinds of practices we've been able to fund with price premiums. Grazing and pasture land investments, agroforestry. So every number you see there under croplands, there's been 13 compost applications on croplands in the last 2 rain cycles that we've had. Conservation crop rotation, we've helped 4 ranchers with that. Cover crop, we've done 15 new farms. We've enrolled 15 new farms in cover cropping, 6 new farms in no-till. So that's just how that graphic looks. Riparian systems at the bottom, those are freshwater creeks. Agroforestry. Agroforestry is when you put above ground carbon, that's what I call it, but it's like trees and shrubs and pollinator habitat back into farmland. That's what agroforestry looks like in that context. And so here's what our small community has been doing for the climate. So we have about 66 growers who are doing this work, and the acreage that they're stewarding is approximately 171,000 acres. A subset of that acreage is where we've been able to see change occur. And so this is the amount of carbon we've drawn down with those different practices. You can see a lot of the carbon we're drawing down in these. So the blue is what we've drawn down, and the brownish color is what we intend to draw down with continued implementation. So this program is very new and small, but it's just us helping quantify the impact of these investments that the textile system's putting back into the land from a metric ton standpoint. And the vision we have, though, is only partially realized. And so this is a work I did with Amanda Cohen to show exactly what our oak woodland very dry and wet season climate could look like under the changes that are occurring with climate. We're obviously going to have to adapt to the changes while we're ameliorating the causes. That's a simultaneous front of work. So land stewards are on the front lines of this. So what we see in California, as everyone knows, is massive increased wildfire pressure. But the sheep and the goat communities, if prescriptively and thoughtfully grazed, can do 2 things. They can reduce the fire fuel load from the European annual grasses that came in during the time of colonization, and start through prescriptive grazing. They can also be the tool for incentivizing perennial grasses, which are native, which have been here for 30 and 40 and 50,000 years. We can incentivize those grasses to come up. If we target graze the annual grasses when they're seeding or close to seeding or just before seeding, we can get rid of the seed bank slowly over time. And it's the European grasses that have become such a firestorm for California. The European oat in particular is what is the fodder for our fires. It's what brings the fire up into the trees. So getting those, it's this odd combination of using the European domestic animals, which are the sheep and the goats, to help us incentivize the perennial coastal prairies that were here before colonization, to then twist that story further to adapt to the climate change that's occurring through industrial civilization. So we layer these strategies without too much judgment and just look for the impact that we're seeking as a community. My vision for our community, which is already happening, is that There are pastoralists, modern young pastoralists who are out there already. There's beautiful examples of this: Shepherdess Land and Livestock, Chaos Sheep Outfit, that are grazing under the oak woodlands, incentivizing perennialization of the system. Where we haven't fully realized this system is in the regionalization of the milling systems, where we want to see the milling systems in proximity to where the animals are grazing. We happen to be on the Pacific Flyway. It's one of the major bird habitats where species are going all the way up to Alaska and down to Mexico and South America. We also want to be a good habitat for the Pacific Flyway. So in combination with returning these coastal prairies, ground nesting birds, their habitats are returned. We can reduce the fire fuel load. We can start building out more regional economic development too, if we can keep the wool local. So that's what that looks like. That's what this looks like in the wet season. So in the wet season, we actually bring the animals out of the oak woodlands and into the vineyards. So in the wet season, instead of having the vineyard systems using herbicides to manage vegetation, we return sheep. Now in Europe, this is done without people thinking too much about it. In the industrial monocultures of our wine system, people always think that California's wine system is so sweet. Well, if you ever come here, you will see it is massive and it is a monoculture. So bringing sheep into it is a very important part of our vision to manage and mitigate herbicide use. So this is already happening to a degree, but we want to accentuate the role of what we call integrated crop and livestock systems. Really important for nutrient cycling, really important for reducing synthetic inputs. Again, renewable energy and milling systems and soil health principles are all amalgamated into the vision. And then we also envision this for cotton. We know that cotton acreage in our region will probably shrink, as will all irrigated croplands as the snowpack disappears. But what we intend to see is an increase in the soil water holding capacity, so that some of our irrigated croplands just simply receive less irrigation, but crops can maintain because the soil carbon content has gone up and thus the water holding capacity has increased. And we do this through cover cropping. We do this through reduced tillage. So this is our vision of, the spring cotton season, where we repair all of the creeks adjacent to these fields. We put in the milling systems. And then the trees, those are looking fairly not very green in that photo, but the idea is that we start alley cropping cotton. So we create some level of tree integration into this. And then this is the last slide. This is the vision we have for the winter system, where we return native forage into the landscapes where cotton is grown. And then we graze down those systems with sheep, and then we return cotton into that. And this, again, this vision is already being articulated on a small amount of acreage, but we just want to see it expanded. And that's it.
Rebecca, you make our future possible. It's very exciting to listen to you, and the knowledge you share with us is astounding. Thank you so much on behalf of everybody.
You're so welcome. It's, again, an honor to be here. And thank you, Lee, for your really beautiful work that you wrote during COVID. I passed that around to everyone. This vision of what COVID could open the door for. And I think we just have to keep putting what you shared forward. I mean, this is an opportunity. This is a time we can actually see regionalization and cultural transformation if we keep putting our foot on it.
We all need to join forces, yes, for sure. Yeah.
People like Rebecca on the scene, I'm sure it's going to be possible. So thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really an educational experience to listen to you. So we're